I'd love to introduce today Jill, who is with us. Jill has experienced cancer, and she is going to come up and actually introduce our next speaker herself. So Jill, will you come and join us?
Hi, my name is Jill, and I'm a cancer survivor. But cancer is not the only challenge that I've faced over the last 2 years of my life or so. I guess it all started at the end of 2017 when I was laid off for the second time since the recession. Then at the beginning of 2018, we found out my mom had endometrial cancer. Just 7 months later, I was diagnosed with the exact same cancer. My mom and I both had radical hysterectomies followed by chemotherapy. Then I had 25 radiation treatments. Things seemed to be going well, and we were both hopeful. But it wasn't very long before we heard some bad news. My mom's cancer was back, and it was very aggressive this time. I dropped everything I was doing for my own recovery to help my dad care for my mom, but just 2 months later, she was gone. Several other emotionally taxing things were going on at this time, but that's a summary of the major events. Hearing, "You have cancer," was not an easy thing for me to comprehend. I had spent the previous year really taking care of myself. Because I wasn't working, I had extra time to prepare healthy meals, I took up running, I lost 20 pounds, and I was feeling really good. Then bam, cancer. I was single, I had no job, and I was nearing the end of my EI, and I was scared. But I instantly went into survival mode. I simplified my life the best I could, and I put my energy into my treatment and positive thinking. Friends and family reached out and offered support. It was really hard for me to let them in because I'm a very independent person and I'm used to taking care of myself. But I learned to ask for help when needed, and I got through. On the last day of radiation, I enthusiastically rang that bell, and I couldn't wait for my recovery to begin. Treatment had gone very well. Sure, I lost my hair, gained some weight, and was exhausted. But compared to what I had witnessed some of the others struggling with, it didn't seem that bad. I really thought within 6 to 8 weeks I would be good to go. I'd find a new job, start playing hockey again, and my energy would return. Well, guess what? That's not what happened at all. I suddenly had no schedule, no blood work results to tell me how I was doing, and no weekly checkups. I went from being constantly busy with appointments to being completely left to my own devices. And all those friends that had been supporting me in the beginning, well, they had moved on. Probably thinking I must be able to care for myself by now. It was then I realized I had pushed all my emotions somewhere deep down because I just didn't have time to deal with those during treatment. And now that treatment was over, all those emotions started to bubble back up. I kept wondering, am I depressed? Is this menopause because of my hysterectomy? Or am I just recovering way slower than I expected? I remember thinking, if only I could figure out what the problem was, then I could address it and move on. Fatigue was a major factor, which affected everything. My energy didn't seem to be returning, my body was weak, and I just didn't feel like doing anything at all. I was often on the verge of tears when I walked my dog, because I was just so damn tired. I was struggling and I had lost all sense of purpose. Some days were a bit better, and some days were just awful. And people kept saying things like, "You must be feeling so much better now that your treatment's over. Have you found a job yet? Are you going to play summer hockey?" They meant well, but they had no idea how hard it was for me to just get out of bed in the morning and make breakfast, let alone do any of those things. And how could they know? I wasn't sharing my true emotions with them. I knew there was help available. I knew there was free counseling. I'd read about it in the booklet I was given. And I had no negative thoughts or feelings about counseling whatsoever. But I kept thinking, my treatment wasn't that bad. Why can't I get myself through this? Finally, on a particularly rough day, I gave in and called to make an appointment. I didn't know it then, but it would be the best thing I could have done for myself. Now that I've had several sessions, I understand that I've been through a lot and I am deserving of help. That I wasn't properly dealing with my emotions before my diagnosis, and that had to change. And that I don't have to do everything by myself. I was also able to have some emotional conversations with my mom before she passed, and I don't think that would have happened otherwise. I can't tell you how thankful I am for all the care and the services that were available to me during my treatment here at the Tom Baker Cancer Center, and how important it is to me that those services continue now during my recovery. I feel like I am currently at a very important intersection in my life, and through counseling, I'm gaining the tools to help me go in the right direction, to help me see what I want my life to look like and how to get there. And I have regained a sense of purpose. I think to me, living your best life is simply doing the best I can every single day, not waiting on some future date when I feel like I've finally recovered enough or everything seems perfect. Instead of waiting for life to happen, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to make it happen. Thank you. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce someone who has had a very positive impact on my life, Dana Mail. Dana is a registered provisional psychologist in clinical and health psychology. She's a member of the Department of Psychosocial Oncology at the Tom Baker Cancer Center, where she provides counseling and educational support to patients and families. Dana's research interests include developing and evaluating psychosocial programs for individuals affected by cancer, and she hopes to make these services become more widely available and accessible within standard healthcare. Dana is passionate about empowering individuals, couples, and families to enhance their quality of life through greater physical health, mental well-being, and social functioning. Please welcome Dana Mail.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Jill, for not only that introduction, but what a wonderful story that you've shared with everyone. And as you were speaking, I couldn't help but think there were a lot of themes in there that I hear a lot when I work with patients and their family members. And obviously, you have such an eloquent way of sharing your experience. And so actually, I want to start today's talk by sharing an analogy that actually Jill shared with me once in one of our sessions, and it really resonated with me, and I think it might with some of you as well. Before I get into that, though, I will just summarize today's talk is something that I call feeling the way forward, and my hope is to help you start to think about your emotions more like friends rather than foes, in the sense that they can really help guide us toward making choices in our lives that bring us closer to the things that are really important to us, and therefore living a purposeful life. So this analogy that was shared with me, so Jill had described to me at one time that her treatment served as a kind of anchor for her, right? So appointments and the people in them, really offering a sense of structure and routine all around this single purpose of surviving. And that once treatment ended, it was though this anchor was severed, right? So feeling kind of lost at sea, I think were the words. And I thought about this in terms of the emotions that tend to crash in, or waves, as we might think about being lost at sea. And I hear this a lot from my patients, that they feel a lot of the time overwhelmed, not really sure which direction to go in. And that's understandable when we don't quite have a moment or the ability to understand what is coming at us in terms of those emotions. So to build on that analogy, this is where I see asking for help as coming in. And I think of this as being like inviting a co-captain aboard with you to help navigate this new terrain. So with the help of someone, whether that is a professional or counselor, or maybe it's just someone that you feel safe to talk about these emotions with, it can get a little bit easier to look up and out on that horizon. And the more that we pay attention to those waves or emotions, we start to understand there's actually different types of waves that roll in. They're not all the same. And we can start to get curious about where they're coming from, where they're driving us toward or pushing us toward, in terms of maybe there's something that we're needing, right? And it's those emotions are there to drive us. So rather than just being overwhelmed and struck by these waves and reacting, we can learn to actually look out and anticipate what's coming and choose our next move. So along the way also, as you start exploring these emotions, it's not uncommon to invite other co-captains along. So whether that's friends, family, people you meet along the way who have also experienced cancer, these are people who might metaphorically toss you a life raft along the way, right? Or shine a helpful light in a certain direction. And so also, I think more recently, and I think Jill, you captured this in your introduction, is that somewhere along the way, you start to kind of be able to make out the shore in the distance, right? And I think of that shore as being kind of this destination of what is your best or most purposeful life. That might be a place where you're doing things that you didn't imagine yourself doing, or maybe you're doing things that you had forgotten about or lost touch with, that there's an opportunity to reconnect with, and with people who you feel accepted and cared for by. So I'm always learning from my clients, obviously. They have a lot of wisdom to share. And so what I'm going to talk about today is some of that wisdom that I've collected alongside, because what I realize is that everybody's particular story and journey is very unique and different, but there are those common experiences, those common emotions or waves that come rolling through in the midst of and beyond cancer. So if that analogy resonates with you, or even parts of it, I want to encourage you to think of the following questions during my presentation. So to consider, what are the emotions or waves that seem to come crashing in most often for you? Are there certain ones that hit you the hardest? Secondly, what might those waves or emotions be pushing you toward? And what might they be saying that it's time to invest more in or to focus more on in your life? And then lastly, to start thinking about how can I best get there? And that can mean two things. So firstly, who might be a part of that process with me, but also specifically, what are the things I can start doing to move toward what I'm needing at this point in my life? So the three main things that I'm hoping that you take away from my presentation is that firstly, our emotions are absolutely normal. They're what make us human. And even though they don't feel good or feel comfortable, because of that, we can interpret them as something being wrong with us. And this actually couldn't be further from the truth. It's that our emotions are kind of like a built-in alarm system that are screaming at us saying something is not right now. And so it's not that there's something wrong with us, but there might be something going on around us that's not quite right. And it's actually helpful that our emotions are alerting us to that. Secondly, our emotions carry a lot of information with them if we can understand them a bit better. Whether or not we listen to the messages that our emotions are trying to tell us is up to us, but fortunately we can get better at noticing those feelings and paying attention to them. And in fact, the information I'm presenting with you today is intended to help you do just that. And then lastly, once we know what we're feeling and what we need, then we open up some options of what we might do to get those needs met. So some of you might be thinking, why bother paying more attention to my emotions? They don't feel good, they make me feel weak, they get in the way. If anything, I'd rather just kind of turn them off or shut them out and focus on something more positive. So on the one hand, I guess to that I would say you're right. In the short term, it can feel increasingly difficult or distressing to move toward those emotions. However, this cartoon, and hopefully you can read it, I think summarizes the point nicely. So it says, for 43 years, Hank had successfully stuffed every feeling he'd ever had, until, of course, the morning when Fred asked if he could borrow a paperclip. So I guess the point of this to me is that although in the short term, suppressing or trying to control our emotions can bring a temporary feeling of relief, that in the long run, those emotions we know tend to come back and with a vengeance. So they come back stronger and they tend to last longer. Not to mention that trying to control our emotions uses up a lot of energy and attention that we could otherwise be using to participate in our lives and the things that are happening in the present moment. And the last point, and I think this is an important one, is that when we try to control or push our emotions down, unfortunately, we do that for all of our emotions. So not just the negative ones, but the positive ones too. So we're less in touch with experiences of feeling joyful or love or excitement. So if we can learn to explore our uncomfortable but not actually harmful feelings in a safe, productive space, like with a counselor or someone else, that we actually can turn that short-term pain into longer-term gain, in the sense that we can actually move through those emotions and resolve them so they're not there swirling around, ready to come back when someone asks to borrow a paperclip. So hopefully I've convinced you why our emotions are worth paying attention to, and now I want to talk about how they work. So we're going to look today at these 5 basic emotions that we all experience as human beings, and there are others. So here we're talking about fear, anger, sadness. I put embarrassment and guilt together, and we'll see why. And joy. We know that there are other emotions that we see across all cultures in the world, for example, surprise, disgust, but these emotions are the ones that I think most relate to building a purposeful life. So what's important to know for today's purpose is that these basic emotions are designed or have evolved to occur in response to predictable events or situations, and they lead us to behave in certain predictable ways that are geared at getting us what we need in those sorts of situations. So these reactions happen instinctively, so whether we're aware of them or not, these emotions are likely occurring. And we inherited these reactions from our ancestors because they actually kept us safe and were able to pass along their genes as a result. So they've kind of stood the test of time in that sense. And so the message here is that our emotions are actually predictable and reliable. So the first emotion we're going to talk about is fear. Other words for this include anxiety, feeling worried, concerned, scared, nervous. And fear is a natural response to some threat or danger or when there's uncertainty lurking. And it really doesn't matter how real or immediate that threat is. So for example, coming across a grizzly bear out on a hike, right? Or whether that's an anticipated threat that we imagine coming in the future. So an upcoming procedure perhaps, or waiting for test results. So some examples that come up in my work with the folks that I work with include medical appointments, right? Awaiting treatment or tests, awaiting for results, experiencing new symptoms or changes in the body. Ending treatment can also be a source of fear. Living with uncertainty of recurrence or prognosis. Facing the possibility of a shortened lifespan or death. For some, it's the uncertainty of whether or not they're returning to work. Financial changes and the uncertainty that comes with that, or even developing new relationships. We're stepping out of our comfort zone, meeting new people in our care, other patients that we might encounter. For some, it's dating after cancer. So lots of unknowns and new experiences that fear, of course, makes a lot of sense that we're feeling. So if we are feeling afraid, it's very common to have some of these reactions, especially if we're on autopilot mode and not really in touch with that fear. So this can look like worst case thinking, or what we sometimes call catastrophizing. So taking a thought or a fear and turning it into an absolute catastrophe in our mind of what might go wrong. Lots of online researching symptoms or Googling things. For some, it becomes tempting to ignore symptoms because paying attention to those things increases our anxiety. For others, it's on the other end of the extreme where they might be extremely hyper-aware of their body. We might see people using substances, so increasing alcohol use or drugs, or even just overusing prescription medications. And as Dr. Ruther mentioned too, eating can really be affected. So sometimes overeating or undereating. But generally there's a theme of avoiding things that make us feel afraid. So what fear is trying to communicate to us is in the context of some threat or danger that we're needing safety, or that we need to get ready or prepare for what we're anticipating coming. So if we know that, and we know that we're feeling afraid, then we can do things to specifically try to get those needs met. And so we can start thinking in a more purposeful way about how we want to behave. So to start, we might ask ourselves, what am I afraid of? What is the worst case scenario? But not letting it stop there. We might examine that thought and think, well, how likely or probable is that to actually occur? So for example, if our fear is, I'm afraid that my cancer is going to come back, then this is where it becomes really helpful to get accurate, reliable information from your specific healthcare providers rather than Dr. Google, right? Because these are the individuals who know your care specifically, or your treatments, your type of cancer, your history. And sometimes actually getting numbers or estimates. Not all oncologists feel comfortable sharing those because they really are just estimates or averages, but sometimes having even just a range of some probability of that risk occurring in the future can be helpful to feed our anxious brains. So in addition to getting information, we can tackle what's in our control. So sometimes it's about a fear of something really legitimate. We're not actually overestimating the risk. We know what's coming, and it's actually really reasonable to start preparing for that thing. And this is where sometimes breaking down a big problem into more manageable steps can be really helpful. So for example, maybe it's about having conversations with your loved ones about advanced care planning. And that can involve lots and lots of different steps, starting with collecting information, scheduling a time to talk about things, filling out paperwork. So lots of things that you can do that might bring some peace of mind if you know that you've taken those steps. And then once we know that we've done everything we can, at this point, worrying about it is not going to actually change the outcome or be very useful. And so this is where setting some safe distance from the stuff that's out of our control can be really helpful. So setting limits to how much time we allow ourselves to worry or check things, for example, online or checking our body. And distraction can come in handy here. So once we've allowed ourselves maybe an hour a day to worry about those things, distracting with other activities. And sometimes we've done all of these things and there's still an unmanageable amount of fear that we are experiencing, and it can be helpful to talk to your doctor or ask for a referral to a psychiatrist to talk about medications. So the second emotion we're going to talk about is anger. So other words would be frustrated, annoyed, mad. And we tend to feel angry when we're being blocked from some goal that's important to us, when we feel like we've been disrespected or that something's been taken from us. So examples of this within the context of cancer include feeling robbed, and this can be of lots of things: our health, fertility, sexual functioning, strength, feeling betrayed by my body. I hear this a lot from people. Being unable to contribute in the ways that we used to or want to, whether that's at home or at work. Having limited choice or power over what's happening to us. Being treated more like a disease or a patient and less as a person. Feeling unsupported or misunderstood, whether that's from people in our personal lives or within the healthcare system. And experiencing pressure from others, so who might have unrealistic expectations of how we're able to perform. So these are some ways that we might express that anger, especially, again, if we're not aware of how we're feeling. So really common to see people being irritable and maybe fighting more with loved ones or snapping on people, yelling, blaming or criticizing, making demands, pushing people away, or just generally behaving more aggressively than might be normal for you. So when it comes to anger, the message it's really trying to communicate to us is that we are needing respect, or that we need to have more power in this moment. So again, knowing that, there are things we can do to seek these particular needs out. So firstly, it's helpful to know, what was I expecting? What was the goal here? And what got in the way of that? To just kind of hone in on how to channel that aggression into a particular place. Or not aggression per se, but anger. And important to communicate to other people what you're expecting or what you might be needing. And figuring out what you can do to help yourself as well. So this is really being that participant in your own care and in your own life, advocating for yourself. Sometimes it's important to say no and set a boundary with people. For example, if they are asking us to do things that we're no longer feeling comfortable to do, or sometimes it's communicating things to our medical team that we don't feel comfortable with, or specifying, when something didn't go the way we hoped, what you would expect going forward. So really participating in that care. And sometimes leaving the situation. This can look like leaving friendships behind where they no longer are supportive, for example, taking back some of that power. And then channeling that aggression into other activities can look like physical activity. It can look like becoming involved with charities or advocating or fighting back against cancer in a bigger way. So another really, really normal and understandable emotion that comes about in the midst of and following cancer is sadness, right? So feeling down, depressed, low, isolated, a sense of grieving. And this makes sense because sadness is in direct response to losing something or someone that was really important to us. And we know there's a lot of that comes with the experience of going through cancer. So there's loss of our previous life or what we considered normal and the future that we might have been planning for, loss of functioning, loss of a sense of health, loss of time, loss of purpose, loss of identity or parts of our identity, loss in our former appearance or body image as it was, sometimes loss of fertility or sexuality as we spoke about this morning, and sometimes loss of loved ones or the connection that came with certain relationships. So common reactions to feeling sad looks like withdrawing from people, sleeping more than we're used to or less than we're used to. Again, same with eating, inactivity. So a lot of TV watching or screen time, doing things that don't require a lot of energy, canceling on commitments that we would typically be involved in, a lot of thinking about how things used to be, and sometimes a feeling of just wanting to give up. So again, if sadness is about a loss, what we're really needing in those times is comfort or reconnection, whether that's with people or things that we used to feel really engaged with or that were, again, important to us. So other ways we might choose to act on sadness when we notice we're feeling that way is, actually crying can be a productive thing. Even though it may not feel like something is coming out of that experience, it is a way of moving that sadness through our body and processing it. It can be helpful, though, to share that sadness with other people, right? Allowing them to comfort us and connect in the process. Sometimes talking with someone about the loss helps us to understand what it is that we're most missing about those parts of our lives that have gone by the wayside or that we're not able to connect with at the moment. Sometimes honoring what was lost or the memory of someone can also be really important. Doing things to physically comfort ourselves, and that can be things like taking a warm bath or making ourselves a nice cup of tea, but also things that we can do for other people is offering hugs, right, or receiving those hugs from others. And finding ways to connect with what was important to us. And this doesn't necessarily mean replacing it altogether, but maybe trying to find elements of what was lost that we can start recreating in different ways. And again, sometimes our mood is so down and low that it's hard to actually engage in any of these steps, and it can be helpful, again, to consider maybe trying a medication that might help you get that extra little boost to just get some momentum to start engaging in some of these things. So embarrassment and guilt, I put these two together because for me they're really about responses to feeling judged or rejected, either by other people or rejecting or judging ourselves. And so some examples of that from a embarrassment perspective, this can come with changes in our physical appearance or our physical or sexual functioning. So worrying about what other people might think about us. Being in a new patient role. So this can involve being more dependent on people than we're used to, and that can be really uncomfortable. And putting ourselves out there socially, romantically, that can also be quite anxiety provoking. In terms of guilt, the ways that I see this come up most often is blaming ourselves for getting cancer in the first place, not being able to fulfill our roles and responsibilities the way that we once did, and sometimes feeling responsible for how our illness is affecting those in our lives. When we tend to feel these emotions, it's common to play things over in our minds about how we interacted with someone or maybe what I did that I'm now regretting, blaming or punishing ourselves, getting defensive, and maybe avoiding people or places where we fear that we won't belong. So these emotions are really trying to communicate to us and others that we need to belong, and also that we need to feel proud and have our dignity. So knowing this, we can ask ourselves, what am I worried about being judged for, or am I judging myself? We can choose to, rather than withdraw, seek out and surround ourselves with people who we believe accept us just as we are, right? And allowing ourselves to be a bit vulnerable with those people. It can involve forgiving or accepting ourselves, and that's not an easy thing, and it can take time. And that's a concept here called self-compassion, that there's a lot that you can look into, and even different resources available to help build up that ability to offer ourselves compassion. It can be helpful to focus on our strengths and act in ways that we feel proud of, so continuing to do the things that we do feel capable of. And then also where there is opportunity to learn from the past, are there things that I can and I'm committing to do differently going forward, whether that's making changes to my health, for example. The last emotion, and I think this is a really important one because they're not all negative, is joy, right? So feeling content, happy, glad, grateful, appreciative. And we tend to feel joy when we're doing things that are important to us or that feel good. And examples of this can include completing treatment, receiving encouraging news or test results, spending quality time with loved ones, having a greater appreciation for our time or to be alive. Grateful cancer was detected when it was. Feeling thankful for support from others that we expected, but also that we didn't anticipate receiving. Feeling appreciative of our healthcare, and then also just this opportunity to maybe learn things about yourself through the process. So if we are the type to push down those feelings, remember, like I said, we tend to kind of numb ourselves to all emotions, then we might be at risk of pushing down joy. And that can look like downplaying our achievements or hiding our excitement, keeping our successes to ourselves, or generally not allowing ourselves to feel happy. I hear sometimes people say, I can't feel happy because then when I lose this experience, it's going to hurt more. So joy is all about our need to experience those things, right? It's kind of saying, this feels good, I have what I need, do more of this. So we kind of owe it to ourselves then to celebrate when we feel that way, to share our joy and our achievements with other people, to practice feeling grateful and maybe saying thanks and expressing that outwardly. Allowing ourselves to be happy, and that can involve just really practicing being present in the moment. We might take pictures of those events or things that we want to reminisce on in the future, and generally taking advantage of opportunities where maybe we have more energy on a particular day or feeling well, and we want to make the most of that moment. Okay, so now that we've looked at all of those 5 emotions, I want to ask you to come back to the questions that I posed at the beginning of this talk. So are you aware, or maybe more aware, of which emotions seem to be occurring for you most often and what they might be kind of pushing you toward? Maybe you're also having some ideas of some things that you might choose to do going forward. And I will say that those examples I share are just examples, but they may not fit for everyone, and you might be thinking of some things that might work better for you. Maybe you realize that you've been getting hit with lots of waves of sadness, and that's trying to tell you that you need to reconnect with certain people in your life or certain activities. Maybe all 5 of those emotions are swirling around a lot these days. Or maybe you're still unsure about your waves and you've realized that you need a bit more time, or you might need some more help kind of making your way through these emotions. But wherever you've arrived, I want to remind you that what is purposeful for one person is not necessarily purposeful for someone else. And there really is no way that we're supposed to be after treatment or living with cancer. And I know it can be, the uncertainty of that can be overwhelming or scary, but it can also be an exciting opportunity to take back some of that control over your life and start thinking about what you want to be doing. So in your handout, there are some ideas of how you can continue exploring your emotions with some support, including some of the free psychosocial resources available at your local cancer center. And depending on your location, there are a range of services, including counseling, psychiatric services, which can involve a medication consultation, financial or other resource counseling, educational classes and workshops, support groups, and spiritual care as well. So I encourage you all to consider whether or how some of those resources might be helpful in your process or your journey as you kind of look out and see your own shore in the distance. And so with that, I wish you all well as you continue to feel your way forward, and I thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today and be a small part of that process. So yeah, good question. So this person has asked, or stated, I guess, emotions from others can get in the way. How can we remain positive? So yes, that's a very common experience. It's hard to hear upsetting news or to be trying to support someone with an illness, because we can try to offer support, but it also evokes a lot of emotion in that other person, right? Another client that I worked with recently spoke of this very issue, and how he managed this was actually, I guess the emotion that this connects to might be maybe anger, at least for this client, right? So feeling frustrated that I can't really be that support to you right now. And so for him, it was delicately communicating to people that saying no sometimes, right? Like not necessarily using the words no, but to say, I can see you're upset. Unfortunately, right now, I can't offer that support to you. I hope that there's someone that you're talking to about this as well. Also just telling people, I think, what we expect or what we might be needing from them. So whether that's suggestions or advice we're getting from people, it can be helpful to just say, I appreciate that you're thinking of me, but I've really thought about these things with my healthcare team, and I've kind of figured it out for myself. So going forward, those things aren't really helpful for me to hear. Right, so it can be uncomfortable, but really I think the theme in those interactions is setting whatever feels like the right degree of a boundary with that person. The other question here is, can I still access help even if I'm done treatment? Absolutely. In fact, most people that come in for counseling support, it tends to be in that period after treatment, because that's when, as Jill mentioned, a lot of those emotions rise to the surface, right? When we don't have those immediate appointments and demands of treatment taking up our time and routine. So absolutely. And we are really fortunate within our services across Alberta that we don't actually have a limit to the time at which we can access, or that you can access those services, so long as the issue is still related to your cancer experience. So it's never too late. Okay, so there's a question, are there any community partners available for support? The way I'm going to read that question is, are there other maybe resources or programs in the community, not through Alberta Health Services, that might be available for some of that emotional support? And absolutely. The one that first comes to mind, because I hear my patients talking about it so positively and consistently, is Wellspring, for example. Lots of free services available there for patients and their families. I'm sure there are lots and lots more, and I'm wondering if we have that. So Canadian Cancer Society. Yeah, and actually that's one of the things that we offer through our Department of Psychosocial Support, is that in addition to counseling, sometimes we can be a resource to refer outward to other resources. So it can be helpful to maybe just connect with a counselor and ask specifically what kinds of resources you might be looking for. And then we have lists and things available, brochures that we can share from that point onward. There's a comment here that says cancer chat. I'm not sure what the question is, but maybe that's just to share that resource with people. So there is an online resource called Cancer Chat Canada that offers support groups for people who may not live in areas that it's convenient to come into a physical setting, and so joining online support from the comfort of your home. I'm not sure, the last time I checked that resource, there was not an ongoing rolling basis of groups, but more so to register and check into when there might be groups upcoming. So again, thanks all for your attention.